It was a chilly evening in the bustling heart of the city, and the streets were alive with the hum of engines and hurried footsteps. Beneath the glow of a flickering streetlight, a young mother stood on the sidewalk, clutching her son tightly in her arms. His pale face rested against her shoulder, his fragile breaths barely audible over the chaos around them. Desperate for help and without a single coin to her name, she did the only thing she could think of. She began to sing. Her voice, raw with emotion, carried through the night air. It wasn't polished or trained, but it had a haunting beauty that made passers-by slow down for a moment, their hearts caught by the desperation behind each note. She wasn't singing for applause. She wasn't singing for herself. She was singing to save her son, praying that anyone might hear her cry for help. And then, just as her voice began to falter, a sleek black luxury car slowed to a stop in front of her. The tinted window rolled down, revealing a figure whose face was hidden in shadows. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. Why had they stopped? Who were they? And what did they want? The mother's heart raced as she held her son closer, uncertain whether this was the miracle she'd been hoping for or something else entirely. The woman froze, her voice caught in her throat as the luxury car idled in front of her. Her son stirred weakly in her arms, his small frame trembling against the cool night air. She instinctively pulled him closer, her heart pounding with uncertainty. The man behind the tinted window remained motionless, his face obscured, the soft glow from his car's dashboard casting faint shadows. Seconds felt like hours, the silence stretching thin and heavy. Finally, the door opened with a quiet click. A man in an immaculate suit stepped out, his polished shoes glinting under the streetlight. He was tall, with sharp features and an unreadable expression that made it hard to gauge his intentions. His presence was commanding, almost intimidating, as though he were someone used to getting what he wanted without question. But in his eyes, there was something else, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even concern. "You've got a beautiful voice," he said, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Why are you out here singing like this?" The mother hesitated, her throat dry. She wanted to scream her desperation, to plead for help, but the words caught in her chest. She glanced down at her son, his face pale and his breath shallow, and she knew she couldn't afford to waste this chance. "My son," she finally whispered, her voice shaking. "He's sick, he needs medicine. I've tried everything, there's nowhere left to turn." The man's gaze shifted to the boy, and for a moment, his expression softened. "How much do you need?" Her lips parted, but she hesitated again. The figure before her didn't seem like someone who would understand the kind of struggle she had endured, nights spent begging for change, days of hunger and exhaustion. Still, she knew she couldn't let pride stand in the way of her son's life. "A few $100s," she admitted quietly. "For the hospital and the medicine." The man's face remained unreadable as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. For a fleeting moment, hope surged through her. This could be the answer she'd been praying for. But just as quickly as he opened the wallet, he closed it again and slid it back into his pocket. "Get in," he said abruptly, gesturing toward the car. "I'll take you somewhere." Panic and doubt flashed across her face. Strangers stopping on the street weren't always kind. She had heard stories of people who disappeared, who trusted the wrong person and never came back. But her son's faint cough reminded her of the stakes. He didn't have much time. She looked at the man again, searching for any sign of malice, but his expression betrayed nothing. "I don't even know you," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know you either," he replied calmly, his tone almost disarming. "But it looks like you don't have many options. Trust me, or don't, it's your choice." She glanced down the street, where people walked by without so much as a glance in her direction. No one else had stopped. No one else had cared. With a deep breath, she made her decision. Cradling her son tightly, she stepped forward and slid into the back seat of the car. The interior was pristine leather seats, soft lighting, and the faint scent of expensive cologne. She felt out of place, her worn clothes and tired face a stark contrast to the luxury around her. The man got into the driver's seat and started the engine, the hum almost soothing.
He didn't ask her name, and she didn't offer it.
The car began to move, and with each passing block, the tension in her chest grew.
"Where are we going?"
she asked finally, unable to bear the silence.
"You'll see," he said simply, his eyes focused on the road. The city lights blurred past as they left the bustling streets behind and entered a quieter, more affluent neighborhood. The houses grew larger, their lawns perfectly manicured and gates towering high. She clutched her son tighter, her heart pounding with uncertainty. This wasn't where she expected to end up. The car slowed and pulled into the circular driveway of an enormous estate.
The house before them was like something out of a movie, grand, with towering pillars and sprawling windows that seemed to glow from within. The man stepped out and opened her door, motioning for her to follow.
"Why are we here?"
she asked, her voice barely above a whisper.
"You said you needed help," he replied. "I know someone who can help."
As they approached the front door, it swung open to reveal an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes. She looked at the mother and child with a mix of concern and warmth, as though she'd been expecting them.
"This is her?"
the woman asked, looking at the man.
He nodded. "She needs a doctor. And some money."
The older woman stepped aside, gesturing for them to come in. The mother hesitated, her instincts warning her to be cautious, but the warmth in the woman's eyes was hard to resist. She stepped inside, her son still cradled in her arms. The house was even more breathtaking on the inside, high ceilings, chandeliers, and walls lined with art that must have cost more than she could imagine. She felt small, insignificant, but the older woman's gentle voice pulled her back. "Let me see him," the woman said softly, holding out her hands. The mother reluctantly handed her son over, her heart aching as she watched the woman carry him into another room. The man leaned against the wall, his expression unreadable as ever.
"Why are you doing this?"
the mother finally asked, her voice laced with suspicion.
He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, holding it up for her to see.
It was a picture of a young boy, smiling brightly. "That's my son," he said quietly.
"He passed away 2 years ago. If someone had helped me when I needed it most, maybe things would have been different."
Her breath caught in her throat. For the first time, she saw something human in him, something vulnerable. But before she could say anything, the older woman returned, her expression serious.
"He's running a fever," she said.
"And he's weak, but he'll be okay with the right care." Relief washed over the mother like a wave, but it was quickly replaced by another pang of uncertainty.
Why had these strangers stepped in? And what would they expect in return?
Before she could ask, the man spoke again.
"Stay here tonight.
I'll have my doctor come by in the morning." She wanted to argue, to say she didn't need charity, but the weight of her exhaustion and her son's fragile state made it impossible. She nodded silently, her mind swirling with questions she didn't yet have the courage to ask. As she sat in the quiet guest room that night, watching her son sleep peacefully for the first time in days, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Who were these people? What was their true motive? And how had a simple song on the street led her to this place, a place that seemed to hold both answers and mysteries? The tension lingered in the air, and she knew her story was far from over. As dawn broke, soft rays of sunlight streamed through the curtains of the guest room, casting a warm glow on the sleeping boy's face. The mother stirred, her body still heavy with exhaustion but her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Her son's breathing had steadied during the night, his fever noticeably lower. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a moment of hope. The stillness of the morning was broken by a knock at the door. She opened it to find the older woman from the night before, holding a tray with a bowl of steaming soup and a glass of water. Her gentle smile immediately put the mother at ease. "I thought you might need something to eat," the woman said kindly, stepping into the room and setting the tray on the small table by the window. "Your son is stable, but he's going to need proper medical attention to recover fully."
"Don't worry, we've arranged everything."
The mother's gratitude was overwhelming, but so was her confusion.
"Why are you helping us?"
she asked quietly, sitting down beside her son.
You don't even know us.
The older woman paused, as if weighing her words carefully. Sometimes, we're put in each other's paths for a reason.
My son, he was a lot like your little boy.
Bright, full of life, but we lost him to an illness that could have been treated if we'd caught it earlier.
Since then, I've made it my mission to help others in situations like yours. I guess you could say it's my way of honoring his memory.
Tears welled up in the mother's eyes as she listened. The pieces were starting to fit together: the man's loss, the woman's compassion. These weren't just wealthy strangers flaunting their privilege, they were people carrying their own burdens, trying to turn their pain into something meaningful. The doctor arrived later that morning, a soft-spoken man with a calm demeanor. He examined the boy thoroughly, his kind eyes reassuring the mother that her son was in capable hands. After prescribing medication and outlining a treatment plan, he turned to the mother with a small smile.
He's going to be okay, the doctor said. It'll take time, but he's a fighter. You're lucky you found help when you did.
The relief that washed over her was indescribable. She felt as though she could finally breathe again, the weight on her chest lifting ever so slightly. She spent the rest of the day at her son's side, watching his color slowly return to his cheeks. Every small improvement felt like a miracle, a reminder of the hope she'd nearly lost. That evening, the man who had stopped his car to help sat with her in the grand living room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "You've been through a lot," he said, breaking the silence.
"But you're stronger than most people I've met."
She looked at him, trying to understand the layers of the man who had so unexpectedly come into her life. "I don't even know your name," she admitted. He smiled faintly.
"It's James.
And the woman you met, she's Eleanor. We've both been through our share of losses. Helping you feels like maybe we're helping ourselves a little, too." The honesty in his words surprised her. It was rare to see someone of his stature speak with such vulnerability.
"Thank you," she said softly. "For stopping that night.
For caring when no one else did."
James nodded but didn't respond immediately.
Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table to her.
"This is for you."
She unfolded it carefully, her eyes widening as she read the contents. It was a check, far more money than she could have imagined.
Enough to cover her son's medical bills, their living expenses, and more.
"I can't take this," she said, her voice trembling.
"It's too much."
"It's not charity," James said firmly.
"It's a second chance. Use it to get back on your feet. Give your son the life he deserves."
Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the check in her hands. She wanted to argue, to tell him it was too generous, but deep down, she knew this was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. For the first time in years, she felt like the world wasn't working against her. Over the next few weeks, as her son's health improved, the mother began to rebuild her life. With Eleanor's guidance and James's financial support, she found a small apartment in a safe neighborhood. She even managed to secure a part-time job that allowed her to care for her son while earning an income. Life wasn't perfect, but it was stable, a gift she hadn't dared to dream of. One afternoon, as she walked her son to the park, she found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. She thought about the night she'd sung under that streetlight, her voice filled with desperation and hope. She thought about the strangers who had stopped to help, their own pain shaping their kindness. And she thought about the lessons she'd learned, that even in the darkest moments, there's always a sliver of light, if you're willing to look for it. At the park, her son ran ahead, his laughter ringing out as he chased a flock of pigeons. She watched him with a smile, her heart full. He was her reason for everything, her strength, her resilience, her hope. Later that evening, as she tucked him into bed, he looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Mom," he said, his voice soft, "why did that man help us?" She thought for a moment before answering. Because sometimes, when people see someone struggling, they remember their own struggles. And when they help, it's like they're healing a part of themselves, too. Her son nodded, his small hand reaching for hers.
Do you think we can help someone like that one day?
Her chest tightened with emotion. I hope so, she said, brushing his hair back gently.
I hope we can.
As she sat in the quiet of her apartment that night, she thought about how far they'd come. The road ahead would still have challenges, but she knew they'd face them together. And maybe, just maybe, when the time came, she'd be the one to stop and help a stranger in need, passing on the kindness that had saved her and her son. It was a story she'd carry with her forever, a story of struggle, of hope, and of the unexpected generosity that had changed their lives. And it was a reminder that sometimes, the smallest act of kindness could create ripples that stretched far beyond what anyone could imagine.